would like to introduce myself. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy. My name is Zhu Xi. I would like to welcome you all to our first annual ethics keynote. This is a perfect day to launch this annual event because it's a word philosophy. So if you just stumbled upon this event, then you're about to hear something amazing. So before we get started, I would like to thank Asian American Student Services for their generous sponsorship. They made the food happen, so I hope you all enjoy. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Leah Kalmanson. Dr. Leah Kalmanson is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Drake University, where she teaches classes in continental philosophy, philosophy of art, and East Asian philosophies and religions. She received her Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Hawai'i at Mānoa in 2010. And her current research focuses on connections between post-colonial theory and comparative philosophy. And her journal articles include Decolonizing the Department, Peter Park, and the Profession of Philosophy in Journal of World Philosophies, and Buddhism and Belfos, Liberatory Aesthetics, and the Radical Subjectivity of Herself and Hypatia, and many others. And she has co-edited 4 books in the last 5 years. I don't know how you do that. So the most recent book is called Comparative Studies of Asian and Latin American Philosophies. Came out from Bloomsbury earlier this year in April. So I would like you to join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you everybody for being here. It's a really big crowd. And I've never given a talk inside a brewery at a campus. This is already the coolest academic experience ever. So I'll try to keep this maybe about 35 minutes, because I personally can't pay attention to someone talking much longer than that. So shoot me at Q&A, and I really do hope I would love to hear some feedback and your ideas about some of what I'm talking about today. So the impetus for this talk started, I think, innocently enough, simply enough. There's a philosopher that I really like. He's my favorite philosopher, and I wanted to teach him in some of my classes. That's him. So when I went to start thinking about how to teach him in my classes, right, where he would fit in the philosophy curriculum, then what kind of started as a simple enough project, this impulse to teach my favorite philosopher, became this dilemma that really struck at the heart, I think, of my identity as a professor in this particular academic discipline. So I want to set up this dilemma with an example that's similar, but which I think I resolved pretty well. So hopefully that'll make what's puzzling about the Zhu Xi case clearer later when I talk about it. In Chinese, as some of you may know, right, the word for Confucianism is not Confucianism. It's a term that translates into something like the scholarly lineage, or like I just like to say scholarship. So these scholars, they were experts in the classical texts of the Chinese tradition. They were themselves commentators on those texts. They were writers and researchers. They were advisors to government officials, or they themselves worked in government. They were teachers in academies of higher learning. They were also experts in ritual etiquette. They could be called on to perform various state rites, including the veneration of ancestors, marking of auspicious festival dates, or even overseeing the ceremonial dispatch of sacrificial animals. All right, so what are these groups, these scholars? You may hear me use the alternative group. Right, are they politicians? Are they philosophers? Are they priests? To this day, as many of you may know, Ruism is not included among mainland China 5 state-sanctioned religions, but it would be impossible to find an English language textbook on world religions that doesn't include a chapter on Confucianism. Right? So basically, the categories of Western intellectual history are inappropriate, right, for categorizing Ruism. And I like to think of it, therefore, as just its own category. And within that category, there are important sort of subfields, subdisciplines, subcategories. Some of these look a lot like philosophy. Some look a lot like science, especially astronomy. It's a very important practice. And others look a lot more like astrology, right, or divination. So I'm a Western trained philosopher, and what I bring into my classes tends to be more or less the philosophical subsection of the root tradition, right? So the question comes up, right, how do I bring that material into my classes? How do I teach it? What kind of assignments do I get, right? Nuts and bolts, right? What do I grade the students on? Because I think, right, in many ways, we communicate what philosophy is through the ways we ask students to do philosophy in our classes, right? We teach them what it is by what we tell them to do. So as a result, the use of Western methodologies and pedagogies to teach non-Western content can still give the impression that all philosophies ultimately cast from a Western model are amenable, right, to the disciplinary practices of the Western philosophy. So I think an example will help clear this up. So I have an assignment that I bet a lot of other philosophers use in the classroom, which involves having students write a dialogue when they study Plato, right? So this is effective partly because it's fun, right? Plato wrote as a playwright in dialogue. We have students write in dialogue, but beyond being fun, it helps the students learn certain basic methodologies of critical thinking, right? Plato uses a set of tools that I want students to use. I want them to identify the unstated or hidden premises in another person's argument. I want them to identify gaps or mistakes in someone else's deductive logic or their own. I want them to understand the role of counterexamples and thought experiments in philosophical argumentation, all of which is true, right? It's work. So a lot of my colleagues in philosophy would probably say that these methods of critical thinking are central to what it means to do philosophy, right? And from that perspective, then, the dialogue activity communicates to students certain core values of philosophy as a discipline, right? What is philosophy? Namely, it's a joint venture, right, of people in conversation seeking the truth. Right? This would be one way that we should teach students what philosophy is by telling them how to do philosophy, right? So these are two early Ruists that I like to teach. In my classes, Mānoa and Shinsa, they both lived during the Warring States period, 4th and 3rd centuries of what we now call the Common Era. And they're famous for their disagreements over human nature, namely, right, do we humans tend to be nice people or not? Their exchange is conversational, there are dialogues. Shinsa is responding to Mengzi's earlier work, and then in Mengzi's work itself, there are explicit dialogues between Mengzi and another scholar named Daozi. So between these three, we get three positions in the debate. One, that people's natural inclinations before any education or training are other, regarding, and humane. The opposite view, that our natural inclinations are towards selfishness and aggression. And then Daozi's view, the third view, that we lack all such predispositions, right, and are just the products of our upbringing, of our education and training. So while teaching this material, I thought, great, I'll have students do a dialogue, right? Write a dialogue, just like I do for the when I teach Plato. But I realized very quickly that there was going to be a mismatch between my usual instructions for the Plato assignment and the actual style of argumentation in the exchanges between Mengzi and Daozi and Shinsa. So in particular, the key methodology here that you get in these dialogues in the texts might be described something like argument by analogy. So here's an example from text. Daozi said, human nature is like swirling water. Make an opening for it on the eastern side, and it flows east. Make an opening for it on the western side, and it flows west. Human nature is not distinguishing between good and not good. It's like water is not distinguishing between east and west. Mengzi replied, water surely does not distinguish between east and west, but does it not distinguish between upward and downward? Human nature's being good is like water tending downward. Now, if you guide it by damming it, you can cause it to remain on a mountaintop. But is this the nature of water? It's this way because of circumstances. that humans can be caused to be not good. It's like this. That's their argument, it's their dialogue. We can see Mengzi and Gaozi expressing their disagreement with each other by constructing effective analogies and then using them, right, to dialogue. At first, Gaozi's analogy seems convincing. Yes, I understand water goes in the direction that I directed indifferently. But then Mengzi's analogy captures some things that Gaozi's leaves out, right? Water in Mengzi's case doesn't just occur in a vacuum, right? We don't just encounter free-floating water that goes in whatever direction we push it. Rather, in the environmental context in which we deal with water, it tends to flow downward unless it is forced upward through purposeful interventions, right? So the reader is expected to see that Mengzi's analogy is the more successful. There is a series of these kinds of analogy-driven dialogues between Mengzi and Gaozi in the Mengzi text. So for the dialogue assignment, I have my students express their own views on various current issues and philosophical topics by constructing effective analogies and using them in discourse with each other, right? So besides being fun and teaching students something about analogical reasoning, this assignment also taught students something about what philosophy is, right? So for one, philosophy still registers here as a joint venture of people in conversation, seeking answers about important questions. But the kinds of answers that are satisfying Socrates in Plato's dialogues and the kinds that are satisfying Mengzi are different, right? Socrates, as you may know, wants a definition of a certain kind, right? He doesn't want an example of a thing. He doesn't want a feature of a thing. He wants a definition that captures what is essential to that thing being what it is. Now, neither Mengzi nor Gaozi nor Sun Tzu, none of the players in this debate, are looking to define things in terms of their essences or what they are independent of any given context, like water and vacuum, right? So almost all the analogies in their text are what we could call ecological, in that they situate things in a larger environmental context. So the successful analogy is the one that best takes into account more and more contextual features, right? That's more complicated, not that whittles the definition down to some one essential important, right? It's very different. By speaking with students about the importance of noticing that water in an environmental context and the complicated context in which we encounter it, that it does behave in certain predictable ways, by talking about that, I'm able to open up a much larger conversation about the role of pattern in Chinese philosophy. This idea of pattern, or structure, or order, or principle, in terms of translate, the ability to discern and appropriately understand patterns and orders in ourselves and in the world around us. This is one of the key approaches to what it means to do philosophy in the Ruist context, right? In the Confucian context. I might mention to students that pattern is always important, even in the early Yin-Yang and 5 phases cosmology, but that the philosophical methodology itself, right, is first made explicit in the development of this theory by Zhu Xi and Song-dynasty, right? Which we could translate something like the study of structure or smooth principle. I might further mention that later philosophers reacted against Zhu Xi's, what they saw as kind of metaphysical speculation, and argued for a return to Marxist moral theory. So in this sense, the dialogue assignment helps me do a lot, right? Cover a lot. It both informs students about certain core values of the Chinese philosophical tradition and allows me to discuss the development of that tradition over time. Let me say that again, right? It lets me discuss the development of that tradition over time. Because have you ever noticed, right, when we talk about Western philosophy, we talk about the ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary periods, right? And when we name our classes, right, that's what we call them, of course, capital ancient philosophy, modern philosophy, contemporary philosophy, something like that, right? Some variation, obviously, across different departments. But if you look at a department's classes in non-Western philosophy, if there are any, right, you'll probably see something like next, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, this philosopher. Don't do this. And my classes are named similar things, right? I teach an introduction to Chinese philosophy. I name similar things. So I'm doing this. But in other words, right, there's no indication of intellectual history, right? Such that the course catalog alone gives students the impression that the West is It's marked by important historical developments, while non-Western traditions are monolithic and ahistorical. It's like we're teaching them Hegel without telling them to teach them Hegel, right? What's more, the vast majority of philosophy programs, and if there is any non-Western content taught at all, these classes are most often counted as electives, right? Unlike ancient and modern, which are routinely across most departments that I've looked at in my non-scientific looking on the internet at departments, are routinely given as the series of courses in history and philosophy that are required for a major. So in this way, right, through our course catalog and through our degree requirements, we express the center and the margins of our discipline to students very clearly. So it's precisely this Eurocentric model of philosophy that I'm trying not to bring in my classroom, right? So of course, I could take the basic positions of Mumsa and Gautza and feed them into a syllogistic format, right? I could reconstruct them as deductive arguments, and I could teach my students to analyze them for deductive validity, just like I'm teaching Socrates, right? That would be to take the Chinese material and use it as fodder for teaching critical thinking like I normally teach it. But that would be to diversify philosophy, right? To diversify philosophical content, right? Without decolonizing the disciplinary methods that I used to teach it, right? So there's a difference here, I think, between diversifying the content of what we teach and diversifying the methods that we use to teach it, right? And I'm interested in diversifying philosophy, believe me, I am, but I'm most of all concerned with the project of decolonization, right? So in addition to being worried about what I teach, I worry about how I teach it, and this takes me to the main dilemma for today, which is what happens when I teach Zhu Xi. So one of my favorite quotes from Zhu Xi is this one. One thing I love about him is that he's really serious about reading books. Here's what is necessary: one blow with a club, one scar, one slap on the face, a handful of blood. Your reading of what other people write should be just like this. Don't be lax. And I mean, I think what a lot of us want in the classroom is for students, in the philosophy classroom especially, is for students to take reading seriously, right? To struggle with the text, to care about making sense of it. Now, Zhu Xi took reading seriously because he believed that reading, reciting, and memorizing a text can have a transformative effect on the mind. He says, for example here, if a person reads constantly, he can pretty much control his mind and thereby keep it constantly preserved. To attain this transformative power of reading, Zhu Xi says we have to prepare our minds. First of all, we need to calm down, right? Just something to remind myself of a lot. When the mind isn't settled, it doesn't understand structure or patterns. Presently, should you want to engage in book learning, you must first settle the mind so that it becomes like still water or a clear mirror. He advises that you do some stretching, maybe some deep breathing, and at one point he recommends that you sit still and hum. In reading, students must compose themselves and sit up straight, look leisurely at the text, and hum softly. Open their minds and immerse themselves in words. He's not the only one that talks like this. Yao Chanlong, someone else that I teach in class, a Buddhist who lived a few centuries after Zhu Xi, talks about flicking your front teeth, like that, to create vibrations that settle the mind. So when reading Zhu Xi with students, I point out that the key dynamics here are musical in a sense, right? They refer to vibration, or resonance, or synchronization, right? He's asking us to tune into the text, and to open our minds to the way the text itself resonates, right? Pattern, the order, the structure. So like with the Mungza assignment, this allows me to bring in a lot more, right? A broad range of philosophical content. I mentioned earlier, right, that the study of Li, or structure as a methodology, is made explicit with Zhu Xi. And in Zhu Xi's time, there was a trend in Ruism to take on big questions, right? What's the nature of the cosmos? What's the origin of the cosmos? What's the place of human beings in it? Ruism traditionally had a kind of moral and political focus, so it was under the pressure from their competition from Buddhism in Zhu Xi's time that they're trying to give them more of a kind of all-encompassing Ruist account, right? A Confucian account of the nature of reality that could stand up to the very robust sort of philosophical resources coming up of Buddhism. So the basic idea, and from their perspective, so there's always been, right, some sort of stuff, right? Chi, which is another really difficult word to translate. This stuff, this chi, it's both matter and energy, and by the time the Song-dynasty is being used to talk about both matter and energy. Matter is very condensed chi, right? Energy is non-physical things like spirits, ghosts, but also our own emotions and intellect, our minds are dispersed chi, right? So it can either be formless or it can have form. They're concerned with the Buddhist idea of emptiness. They say the Buddhist idea of emptiness makes no sense, right? You can't get something from nothing. So that there has to be some sort of existence that persists all the time, at least in some unformed way. And this is this primordial formless chi. From out of this kind of formless soup, distinctions tend to arise. This is the differentiation into yin and yang, the 5 phases, and eventually a myriad of things in the world, right? Know it. This tendency toward differentiation and increasing complexity is precisely the kind of the way that we get brought in the Song-dynasty to talk about these philosophical questions, right? It is the structural tendencies of the organizing principle inherent in Chi itself. So Li is both normative and descriptive. The cosmos, right, does tend to manifest certain orders and patterns, but bringing forth and nurturing better, more harmonious, more vibrant orders and patterns is the special occupation of us, right? It's a special role of human beings. And the neat thing about this theory is that it's not really a simple linear progression. It's not just an origin story for the cosmos, as it were, cosmogony. We have access to this primordial formless chi all the time. We can cultivate it within ourselves and within the world around us. So this helps to explain Zhu Xi's favorite text here, which I'm going to quote to you at the it's probably too tiny for you to see, which really kind of sets his core agenda in the classroom, right? Zhu Xi was a professor at an academic academy of higher learning, right? And this is the text that he made his students memorize. It's a text that was considered central to his whole philosophical project. I'm not giving you all of it, just a little blurb here. It's from the Book of Rites, Great Learning. So, and it talks about this link between self-cultivation and social order, right? So the ancients, in wishing to display bright virtue in the world, first brought good order to their own states. Wanting to bring good order to their states, they first regulated their households. Wanting to regulate their households, they first cultivated themselves. Wanting to cultivate themselves, they first corrected their minds. Wanting to correct their minds, they first made their intentions sincere. Wanting to make their intentions sincere, they first extended their knowledge. Extending knowledge consists in investigating things. Investigate things and knowledge is extended. Extend knowledge and intention becomes sincere. Make intention sincere, and the mind becomes correct. Correct the mind, and the self is cultivated. Cultivate the self, the household is regulated. Regulate the household, the state is brought to good order. Bring good order to the state, and the whole world will be at peace. From the ruler down to ordinary people, all must regard the cultivation of the self. So in presenting this very famous text, right, to his students, to his own students, he told them that investigating things meant what? Reading books, right? Reading first and foremost the classics, right, through which certain wisdom is transmitted. His theory of reading is precisely that it helps us cultivate the chi of our own minds, right, of the human mind, and bring good order to the self, right? Here's him describing what he thinks is happening. The value of a book is in the recitation of it. By reciting it often, we naturally come to understand it. I don't know how the mind so naturally harmonizes with the chi, feels uplifted and energized, and remembers securely what it reads. As he goes on to talk about, right, throughout a lot of his work, to read a book is really to palpably imprint on the mind. It's to restructure the mind according to a better structure or order, right? Precisely the activity of being human for Zhu Xi. To memorize and recite that book as a method of chi cultivation is to sustain those effects on the mind and to transform the self over time, right? And for Zhu Xi, this is the power of learning. It's the transformative power of philosophy. The larger goal might be to transform the mind into the mind of a sage, but Zhu Xi mostly seems happy with students who can transform themselves into literate, well-cultivated, and most of all, humane members of society. So, despite my students' strong protests, I make them memorize a text when I teach Chinese philosophy. philosophy, I usually use the Great Learning, the opening passages, which we just saw a part of. The whole passage is a little under 300 words in English. We take it a few lines at a time. We memorize it bit by bit. About every other week throughout the semester, we have a cumulative quiz where they write down what they know so far. Sometimes we recite it out loud together, synchronize our voices. Sometimes we practice what's called quiet sitting before reviewing it, and this is a meditation practice. It originates in Buddhism, but the Confucians adopted it widely as a scholarly method. They didn't adopt it as something to do with the monastery, right? That they criticized it. It's something you do as a scholar before you read a book. And then finally, toward the end of the semester, we read commentaries in the Great Learning by Zhu Xi and his kind of later rival, Wang Yangming. And I end this semester-long study of that 300-word text by having students compose their own commentaries on it. We're toward the end of that precise assignment this semester in my introduction to Chinese philosophy class. So the philosophical methodologies that I use with students, right, involve memorization and recitation as a method of philosophical study. Certain contemplative practices like quiet sitting, meant to prepare the mind to read. And finally, commentarial writing as a form of philosophical expression, which is its own kind of writing in philosophy, right? So like with my Mungza assignment, my goal is to have students do philosophy with the tools of the philosophical traditions that I'm teaching them about, and not to simply feed, the non-Western content into Western paradigms. So what do these methods tell students about what philosophy is? Many professional philosophers might say that the core of philosophy is about critical thinking or rational argumentation or even the perennial search for truth. All three are related to an understanding of philosophy that I would say is ultimately static and teleological. Static in the sense that we mean the analytical decomposition of arguments and assertions, right? So there's a process with a terminal point, you go so far and you're done. Teleological then for that same reason, right? We're progressing toward a fixed goal, right? A judgment of truth, more or less. In contrast, I think the Chinese tradition gives us a picture of philosophy that is dynamic and creative and open-ended. Dynamic in the sense that we mean the active conditioning of the mind to prime it for learning through practices, right? Critical thinking is obviously not absent here, but it's a baseline minimum needed to avoid certain basic errors in reasoning, right? Beyond this baseline, philosophy is about conditioning and transforming the mind through scholarly discipline. For that same reason, it's open-ended, right? The goal of philosophical learning, something like being a well-cultivated person or being a sage, these goals are themselves framed in terms of kind of a heightened state of flexibility or a capacity for appropriate responsiveness in unfamiliar situations, right? That's what the philosophers do. And maybe that sounds like, so far so good, right? But I want to stress again that for Zhu Xi, this is a project of moral self-cultivation. So in Daniel Gardner's translations of Zhu Xi, which I've consulted for my own translation, in his original versions, he translates E as moral principle, not structure or pattern or order. Like I tend to, and I have reasons for avoiding moral principle because it sounds so beyond philosophy. But in his original phrase, in his original translations, if we go back to those, the moral side of the reading, right, of what it means to read a book comes out more clearly. So for example, he says, in reading, open the mind wide, and moral principles will appear. Or now you should put aside unimportant matters, stop engaging in idle thought, and concentrate the mind in order to get a real sense of moral principle. Again, right, to put it in precise terms for Zhu Xi, reading is a way to concentrate the chi of the mind, right? To align the mind, the energy of the mind, with a cosmic principle that brings proper moral order to human nature. So I've just told you I use quiet sitting in my classes with students, which is a Buddhist meditation style, and I've said that we read and memorize texts according to Zhu Xi's instructions. Some of you may know there are similar practices in, for example, Catholicism. There's a tradition of contemplative or meditative prayer, as well as a contemplative approach to reading scripture, right, like Theophania. So imagine now that I'm teaching Christian thought and not Confucian thought, right? And imagine that I've asked students to personally engage in activities like contemplative prayer or lectio divina. These practices are indeed, right, appropriate methodologies for teaching the content that I'm teaching, right, for studying Christian thought. They're aimed at encouraging communion with the divine, as that is understood in Christianity. So what's the difference, right, between me asking students to experience Christian teachings firsthand by using the lectio divina method to commune with God while reading, versus, right, me asking them to experience Confucian teachings firsthand by using the quiet sitting method to open their minds to cosmic principle before they memorize a passage from the Great Learning? I don't have an answer to that question. I really hope some of you have opinions, because I do see at least that in letting Confucian thought and letting Ruist thought and practice shape what philosophy is, right, inside my classroom, I have put myself and my students in a gray zone, right? And I do think, kind of start to wrap this up, this isn't just a gray area because I'm sort of evangelizing for Confucianism, although that is kind of Christian analogy makes me, that's part of it, right? But the gray area is so murky because I think I'm explicitly connecting class assignments to moral self-cultivation in the way that I am, right? And here's where I think that this dilemma isn't necessarily unique to non-Western philosophy or teaching non-Western philosophy. I think philosophy in general is a little bit in this gray zone, right? So I'm thinking here, I think this is my last. Of this book, which I think was pretty well received, Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life, Spiritual Exercises from Socrates. So he talks about the fact that Western philosophers traditionally engage in a range of contemplative spiritual exercises. That's how they were described. For reasons he discusses, these fell out of favor by the modern period. So even without referring to Chinese literati pedagogies, right, contemporary academic philosophy and its practices have lost many of these kinds of methods for scholarly self-cultivation that once would have been considered part of the discipline, right? So part of me wants to very loudly and confidently say that let's take philosophy back, right? Let's reclaim our role as instructors of like spiritual practices, or say to students, you know, philosophy is a project of moral self-cultivation. And I mean, I think in general, right, the liberal arts conceive of themselves as doing something like that. But I guess like the devil's in the details, right? In contemporary academia, do we really have that sort of close personal mentoring relationship with our students? Should we, right? I, for one, try to maintain what I consider a healthy dose of professional distance. And even though I've brought a lot of what are, for me, very experimental methods into my classes, I can't say that I'm doing it comfortably. I talk a way better talk here in front of you than I walk in the classroom. It would be a lot easier on me, right, to go back to reading the Analects like a Western philosopher looking for a virtue theory of ethics, and to go into class and talk about that. So in the end, though, I do think a lot of what I've said will resonate with anyone who's worked in the field of contemplative education. Right up the road at Boulder, in Boulder at Naropa University, you can go get certified to do just that, contemplative education. The more I've learned about traditional Confucian pedagogies, and the more I've thought about Pierre Hadot's work on the forgotten spiritual practices of Western philosophy, the more I've begun to think that something like what they're doing up at Naropa ought to be part of our training as philosophers. But I also think that many of my colleagues would have good reasons for resisting the title of moral instructor or spiritual advisor, or having those kinds of expectations written into their job description, right? So I'll just end by saying that this is the core of the dilemma, right? To truly diversify philosophy, and to be blunt here, it's more than just slotting a module on Buddhism into your introductory class, right? And it's more even than hiring someone like me to come and teach a bunch of classes that will all count as electives in a philosophy program. But to truly diversify philosophy in the sense of structural change, right? To let non-Western traditions set the terms for our disciplinary methods and pedagogies. To truly diversify philosophy in that way is to rewrite the job description, right? It's to change the terms of our contracts. So, meaning that philosophy can't go into the cross-cultural encounter and then walk out the same, right? With the same disciplinary identity it had before. There will be change. And of course, it can't have multiple identities to really accommodate multiple perspectives. and to accommodate them in a way, again, that doesn't just assign them a role as optional in an education in philosophy. Would require changes to the curriculum, changes to our degree requirements, and changes to our pedagogies where we do in our classrooms. And my goal today really has not been just to burden you with my litany of complaints, dilemmas, but to hear more ideas, right? To hear your ideas about what a truly diverse philosophy might look like moving forward.
We have plenty of time, 40 minutes or so, for discussion.
You don't have to keep me up here for 40 minutes.
So, do you like some questions?
Sure.
So I had two thoughts and then one question. First, regarding what you brought up about the Catholic tradition of philosophy versus Buddhism, I think potentially that the reason that one may be more uncomfortable and see more out of balance is simply because of the structure of Catholicism, and as compared to Buddhism, given that there's a central deity. In Catholicism, there is not Buddhism, and I think that the ritualistic aspect is less impactful to a culture like ours than it would be in China, for example. Like we just don't see the same Confucian rituals in the United States. It doesn't impact us the same way. My second thought, I forgot, so we'll go to my question. How do you ask for students, and then if so, how do you ask them to compare the work of Lao Tzu with
That's a good question. You know, we do read, and the Song-dynasty is really a great time period for that, right? That's when we sort of get a lot of people criticizing their colleagues and their peers who take a different path, right? So you've got Taoists being criticized by Buddhists, you've got Buddhists being criticized by Buddhists. So it's a great time period in terms of looking within the tradition, right, to see what kinds of arguments and responses are being given to each other about each other. I do try to do that, put it that way. I try to put the traditions in dialogue with each other within the appropriate historical context. And I kind of want to go back to a comment too that's really interesting. And I actually made my students talk about that one day in class, right? I told them a little bit about it, you know, like, so what if I made y'all do that, right? What would you think? And I felt like it was a real dilemma for me, but they didn't, they more or less agree with you. They're like, yeah, it's different. It's not Catholic. I'm still doing it. So yeah, I tried to kind of push it, but they seemed very comfortable with the activity. But I wait, you know, because I have had students who I've taken on site visits. I've had students who have raised concerns, students from evangelical backgrounds, not Catholic, evangelical backgrounds, raise concerns about being asked to meditate for instruction in Buddhism. So if I do any kind of like talking about that, if I have had a meditation instructor come to class, show people what to do, I always give students an alternative activity so that they don't have to do something that they don't, you know, they go against their own religious conviction. So I'm sort of prepared for that pushback. I almost never get it though. Okay.
Well, and I remember my other thought, which I think kind of ties into that. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, actually, because I intend to take a course on ancient philosophy next semester, which is currently offered. And someone was saying that they were a philosophy minor, and they're like, oh, I would just really love to diversify my perspective. All I know is Western philosophy. And then they were like, so since you know a little bit more than me at this current juncture, what would you say is the difference between Eastern and Western? And I said, well, and they suggested potentially that Western philosophy is moving away from spiritual motivation, is moving away from any sort of religious overtones or spiritual guidance or cultivation, while Eastern philosophy, at least historically, has moved towards it. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a big question, right? And I get that question from students. And I actually try to prevent students from thinking in those. I really do. I try to not make broad generalizations about the trajectories of, and I think the Pierre Hadot book is instructive here, right? Even of the Western tradition, because we kind of contemporary academic philosophers have also lost a lot of what we used to kind of do in terms of practices related to scholarship, right? Contemplative practices. So there's a sense in which I think once you dig under the surface, there's actually a lot of overlap in kind of places for conversation across these traditions where they are sympathetic with each other, right? So I do think sometimes those kinds of very large generalizations, I even hesitated about what I said about the idea of, some people considering the hard philosophy some kind of critical thinking and it being a teleological process. That's a conversation. Just because I think that what actually becomes more challenging rather than trying to understand something in very general terms is precisely trying to understand it in the details, right? Like teaching Zhu Xi just innocently enough through the methodologies he himself used in the classroom. And how that kind of, is this whole can of worms, right? It's actually a lot more nuanced and complicated when we talk about the tradition he's a part of. That's kind of a rambling answer.
Thank you. So I was going to ask you to say more about this translation issue with respect to moral principle or structure or something like that. But then, as I was thinking about that, I was wondering if you regard translation as a practice that's narrowly static and teleological, or is there something more like a contemplative practice in translating Chinese terms, translating Greek terms?
That's a super question. That question kind of took a turn there at the end, and I wasn't expecting. I really like that idea. Because I do think that and there's a lot of good work in translation theory, right? About how it's not a kind of static or teleological process, right? It's not just mapping. I like this idea of there being a contemplative practice in translation. I don't know quite where to go with that yet, but yeah, the issue of translation is huge. My facility with classical Chinese is limited. I can work with some of the classic texts, and I try my best to bring as much of it into the classroom as I can, because I do think there's some nuanced understanding of things. It helps them see some resonances across the text, and they understand that this is actually the same character being used here, here, and here. You're all, which you've got to all translate differently. They wouldn't otherwise make. That's a good question. Yeah, I'll think about that some more. But no, the short answer though is that I definitely don't see it as a static process. One best way to translate the Greek learning into English.
To go back to your earlier slide in which you laid out the course names for Western philosophy and Asian philosophy courses. How have you overcome that problem of treating philosophical traditions through cultural terms and putting it in a historical term? Have you had to make more historical? Have you done that?
In an ideal world, and I don't know where this would fit into a larger philosophy curriculum in terms of degree requirements, right? But in an ideal world, I think, or at least department, I would teach you Song-dynasty philosophy, Song-dynasty philosophy, because something like that. Because even the terms, right, ancient, medieval, and modern, are terms that refer to the intellectual, the trajectories of the Western tradition as it understands itself. It understands itself teleologically through moving from sort of ancient, primitive ways of thinking and being to enlightened, modern ways of thinking and being in that historical construction. As is very, this is old news for anyone who kind of post-colonial theory. It's not, you can't export that and apply it to other traditions. When it has been exported and applied to other traditions, usually they don't show up so well, right? They show up as behind us somewhere, right? So when I said we're teaching Hegel without teaching Hegel, right, that was his theory. History began, if there's any Hegelians in the audience, correct me, all right? But it begins, right, in Asia. He has that idea, but then Asia stops developing. It becomes stagnant and ahistorical in history. The arc of history leaps, right, over to Europe. So how do I combat that, right? So yeah, I wouldn't combat it by just including more non-Western content into existing ancient philosophy courses, because the name is problematic, right? I wouldn't combat it by having a class called Ancient Chinese Philosophy. But I would like to see, at least on my own, course catalog, something like Han-dynasty, Warring States period, Song-dynasty. I thought about for a while teaching a class called Yi Shui. I thought about teaching a class called Samjiao, which is the three teachings of Buddhism, Confucianism, in Taoism, because that was sort of, at least in the kind of, the literati, the kind of scholarly tradition, that's how those three were conceived of as having some resonance with each other. So I was thinking of all these ways to bring in appropriate terminology from within the intellectual history, like the way the Chinese historians over time have understood their own intellectual art, right? And students will center this process, right? So we are at Drake, like many institutions, we have monetary problems. And when I teach Introduction to Chinese Philosophy, I get a solid group of 30 students. When I did try to teach one called Song-dynasty philosophy, I had 8 students. And under pressure to fill my seats, right, I reverted back to Introduction to Chinese philosophy.
What about going the other direction for modern times? Key vision, of course, on late modern to modern.
Yeah,
Chinese
new
philosophy.
Confucianism would be a class I would teach, so like 20th century thinkers would be a cool one to teach, right? Yeah, and I have taught classes. I've taught, my original area of expertise and background is in Japanese philosophy, so I have taught a 20th century Japanese philosophy class. Also though, 8 students or so, right? So I haven't taught it in a while because I have trouble filling it. But yeah, I do teach some more contemporary materials. And I've taught a class just in comparative philosophy where I brought in a range of like state of the field kind of stuff. What are people doing in the field today?
Can you say a little bit more about memorization? And so what does it bring out of the sort of philosophy that you focused on today? And would it bring things out of Western philosophy, the contrast you drew? I mean, what would it bring out of those two different kinds of philosophy? Or would it only work in one?
That's a good question. I just taught an article you might be interested in actually in a class last week. It's called Teaching and Learning in a Rinzai Zen Monastery by Victor Hori. I can write that down later. And he talks about what he calls, his words here, the relationship between rote memorization and mystical insight at Zen monasteries. He's talking about memorizing koan and memorizing sutras, memorizing material, and then having an insight. But he compares it because he's a philosophy professor at McGill, right, or he was until he retired, I guess. He talks about teaching logic to his students in philosophy classes and logic classes, right? And how the ones, eventually, some students just are able to see the answer, right? They can just look at the problem and see the proof that they need to then write out, right? They can just see it, insight. He says that their insight has been enabled because they were the students who took him seriously when he said, you have to memorize the rules first, right? So they did the memorization work first. They internalized the process that way, which then gives them the ability to just see the proof, right? So he's actually trying to make a connection between memorization and insight more broadly. And yet he draws on his experience again, both that he spent 13 years in a monastery practicing, but he also is in a philosophy professor. So he links it to logic, which I thought was pretty cool. And I made the students read it because I wanted them to be like, see, it's not just me who says this about memorizing stuff, right? Other people say it's good for you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm really compelled by your efforts to dismantle the hierarchies of knowledge within philosophy and the academy more generally. And my question is, I'm curious how you navigate some of the ethical concerns about taking up knowledges from beyond the West when there is, a colonialist, imperialist, and orientalist political framework that shapes our access to those knowledges and whatnot. And I think specifically, because I like the distinction that you make between diversification and decolonization. Right? And for me, I'm wondering, how might something like indigenous philosophical thought be taught in a class when the thought is wedded so much to particular places, right, and to particular lands, and without it's not rooted in some sort of like biological essentialism. But some folks like Vanessa Watts, who's an Anishinaabe, develops a notion of indigenous place thought, right? And how thought emerges out of centuries of connection to a particular land. And so I'm wondering how, these kinds of practices that you're talking about and that I'm really drawn to, it's like we can't separate out the knowledge from the practices. What might that look like in terms of indigenous thought, and what sorts of things do you see in as buffers against like that just lapsing into, like going native or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's constantly this battle in my mind between wanting to vocally and kind of vocally and proudly bring these methodologies into my classes and then say to my colleagues at the APA, see, right? Versus worrying about my own cultural appropriation, right? I'm not Asian or Asian American, right? And I'm teaching this material to students, right? And I'm the one who got the job at my school talking about kind of political pressures and the demographics of the market, right? I don't have a good answer to your question, but I will tell you that the work when I first started this was precisely inspired by some work on indigenous methodologies that was a little bit more coming out of the social sciences. But so I was in Hawaii, you're in the philosophy department, right? Hawaii too, right? Yeah. So the philosophy department over there, as you may know, Hawaii is a center for post-colonial and decolonial thinking, not in the philosophy department. So part of my kind of path in thinking about this in my own research was, why is that, right? Like, they are also dealing with questions of Eurocentrism, just like we are in our philosophy department, right? They are also dealing with questions of kind of the political pressures of the Western tradition on philosophy, right? How it's shaped the discipline. Why aren't we talking to people right here at the University of Hawaii who do this amazing work, post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, and indigenous methodologies, right? So that was it. It was mainly not that I thought I mainly wanted to bring that stuff into comparative philosophy, right? So rather than having anything to offer beyond, I was just thinking, shouldn't we change our disciplinary practices, right? Rather than just diversifying the content. Like, I've gone to Hawaii and I've learned all about Asian philosophy, right? But what have I learned methodologically speaking that's different from what someone who went to any Western philosophy graduate program would be trained in, right? I can also, construct symbolic proofs and symbolic logic, right? So like, what did we do that was different in terms of our methodologies? That was so. It was precisely inspired by all that excellent work coming out of people working kind of in indigenous thought traditions that I, so that's the genesis of this work.
To follow up on that. So I also like the idea of the distinction that you're making between diversification and decolonization. I was thinking that in diversifying our discipline, I think there is a particular way in which Asian philosophies are received, right? And Asian philosophy can make a space in the discipline, right? In a sort of non-political way. So when we talk about non-Western thought, we think of Buddhism, Confucianism, right? Sort of a like safe and apolitical, right, context. And I understand that you edited this volume, the comparative thought between Asian and Latin American philosophy came from that sort of problem, right, that we discussed before. So would you like to say something more about that? How?
Well, and a mutual friend of ours, David Kim, has this quote in a book where he says something to the effect of, it's no accident that Asian philosophy has kind of made inroads into the academic discipline, more so than, for example, indigenous philosophers, right? Asian philosophy is already a very small group of people compared to the larger, at the APA, as it were, tiny little societies. Indigenous philosophy, way tinier, right? Way tinier. And he again links it back to Hegel, right? The assumption that Asia was always kind of second all along, right? Almost there, right? Other people even lower, so that's, again, no accident that Asian philosophy has been accepted and kind of lauded and appreciated as a almost there kind of a content to teach in your philosophy classes. And this is kind of going back to that question of like differences between like Western, non-Western, Western, and Asian. That's part of why I kind of resist that language of saying one's more spiritual than the other, and partly because of the political question, right? You don't want to make it seem so apolitical that it's safe. I think part of what I'm doing is trying to say, well, it does have its own agenda. And maybe that does have to do something with like the cultivation of mental energies, right? It's kind of a spiritual energy. But that itself, if we take that seriously, is a way bigger can of worms, right? That itself is the agenda of that particular pedagogy, and that to adopt that within the discipline alters philosophy, right? Alters the discipline of philosophy.
talk. I found it really illuminating. And what you were just talking about agendas kind of relates to the question I had. Because you started off by saying this thing that I thought was right, that was provocative, because I thought it was right but hadn't thought about it before. What we ask the students to do teaches students what philosophy is. And so I was wondering if the quiet sitting, I hear part of your concern is that you're teaching students to do this practice of quiet sitting that seems to them be doing this kind of disciplinary work, that if we translate it into a different question like prayer, it becomes sort of something seems wrong there. But I wonder if we went in another direction and thought, well, when we discipline people into logic, we're doing something similar. And so part of the discomfort that's getting shown through quiet sitting or through prayer should be a discomfort we have about the norms that we're inculcating through things like the logical proof.
Yeah.
But because it's normative in our teaching context, it doesn't strike us as something that we're doing to students, right? We're just helping them become clearer thinkers.
Yeah.
But I assume that in this tradition, the quiet sitting is a way of becoming a better thinker in that sort of state. So I'm just wondering if the discomfort is also productive, pointing back to the things that that are our water.
I really like the way you put that, and maybe I'll use that, in terms of defending what I do, right? Because logic is disciplining the mind as well, right? We are happily and proudly disciplining our students' minds when we teach them logic. And before I make Zhu Xi sound conservative too, I will say he definitely didn't say that you only read texts that are going to have sort of a positive effect on your mind. It's not that. It's way more complicated than that. He does say you need to read the classics, but also read the commentaries. He says you should read not only the classics, but what he calls the vulgar texts. Because you need, and there is an order to things, right? You should definitely condition the mind and train the mind through memorization of the classics early on. But a sophisticated thinker, right, one whose mind has been disciplined, is then capable of doing the kind of critical and creative work of a scholar later, a mature scholar, right? He says the great learning should be translated as learning for adults. Because the mature scholar, right, a mature scholarly mind, should then read the difficult texts, the texts that he thinks are wrong, the vulgar texts, and engage with them. But there's prep work done, on the earlier end to do that. I like that comparison. That's why we call them disciplines, right? We've all been, that's what grad school is, right? You're disciplined into your discipline, right? And then we kind of pass that to students. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm in another class right now about consciousness and mindfulness that uses neuroscience at the same time that we're learning about other philosophies to kind of talk about consciousness. But part of that class is that we do a meditation every single class, through it. But I guess one of the reasons it doesn't run into problems of we're just teaching religion or worry, I guess, from a Western viewpoint between the Eastern ones that we learn about, so we learn about Buddhism and all that, is because that we're also mixing it with very diversified fields and application, and that we're learning about research that's being done between monks and neuroscience that proves connections. We had a question about memorization earlier. There's studies proving this method that they use actually neuroscientifically helps this and can be used for this. Or these religions or these religious concepts also came out of society, and here's their effect on society, and here's the way they can be used. They have been used back and forth between society, actual application kind of way, and a way that kind of disconnects it to where we're not learning, we're not being taught religion, but we're being taught it in a separate, connected sense around other fields. So maybe that is a direction to go that might be able to make it more palatable to people who might be having hesitations, I guess, in that direction.
And these practices under the kind of rhetoric of mindfulness absolutely have made it, outside the monastery and into many academic departments, right? One thing that's interesting to me is that, at Naropa, for example, a place that's full of education, but they're often borrowing from Buddhist models and saying, how do we kind of get it out of Buddhism, put it somewhere else, right? How do we do this in a different context? And the interesting thing about the Confucian tradition is they already did that, right? They actually took, meditative practices out of the monasteries, out of Buddhism, and started using them as scholars. But there's a sense in which the Song-dynasty was doing contemplative education before, Mānoa University was doing contemplative education, and I think there's actually a lot of interesting cross-pollination there to talk about. But I also am kind of sometimes uncomfortable with the sanitizing of the tradition that happens when it gets called mindfulness and turned into kind of science. Do you know what I mean? It makes it kind of pluck it out of its historical context, its cultural context, and its practical context, right, for a lot of practitioners. And then, anyway, yeah, that's a cool class that I'd like to see you still.
Yeah, that's good.
You want upstairs?
Oh.
I don't want to startle anyone. The language you used earlier, your slide on the decolonization. I thought about it a moment in terms of thinking of philosophy as a colonizing procedure, and it struck me as a bit paradoxical because on the one hand, when you encounter somebody from a different perspective and you say, well, what you're saying is what we already said that as well, so you're just doing what we did in a different way. But then the opposite happens where the following response is, but that's not philosophy. We already figured it out. So Confucius says this, and it sounds exactly like what Socrates did. So on the one hand, you're already just repeating what we know, but on the other hand, it's not philosophy. So I wonder if there's a way to look at this as a critique on whether this word philosophy actually has that sense built into it, where it's really just a matter of assessing and then assimilating worldviews.
Right. It's a good question too. All these are great questions. I do think there are two ways that you can productively talk about resisting Eurocentrism and philosophy. One way is to say it's not limited to the Western tradition, right? Bring in other perspectives. Another way is to say it's provincial. It is a product of the European intellectual history, right? Bruism is its own category, something else, right? Doing its own thing on a different timeline with a different trajectory. And that we shouldn't assimilate the one to the other, right? So that impulse to diversify philosophy, yes, I think can easily, has easily become a colonizing impulse, right? To bring other stuff into the fold and make it look like what we are achieving. This idea, and I do think terminology, this kind of gets back to the translation question, that's why it's so important. There's some thinker who I wish I could give you his name now to give credit to this quote, forgetting his name, who says something to the effect of, we will ask if Confucius was a virtue ethicist, but we would never ask if Hegel was a Confucian or if he could his way to turn there. And yeah, it seems like, of course, virtue ethics is like this generic term, and Confucianism it's like studying Confucius and his followers, so why would Hegel know about that? But that's why it's important to remember that the word is scholarship, right? So we can ask, was Hegel a scholar? Was he a good scholar? I think by literati standards, he probably wasn't, right? So I'm not saying necessarily, and this is kind of this idea of countering the colonial move, that I don't want to just turn the tables, as it were, and rewrite all philosophy from the perspective of like Chinese intellectual tradition, right? Intellectual history, or turn contemporary departments into like traditional academies, right? Literati academies. But I am interested in being kind of savvy, maybe in turning the tables at a certain moment, right? Precisely for effect, right? To destabilize the kind of neo-colonial power structures that we all work within in philosophy, right? So, and I don't know if there's a good answer to that question beyond sort of like, is it possible I'll say this, I don't think it's possible to diversify without being mindful of colonial power dynamics. So that any move you make, you're always kind of constantly balancing that, right? Maybe like to the other question, the question of like constantly thinking about the difference between fruitfully and productively taking up techniques and methods that intervene in hegemonic practices in philosophy versus me and the question of cultural appropriation. So it's constant kind of navigation.
So you keep bringing up Naropa, and actually I was going to go to Naropa University to study contemplative art therapy.
I may end up there for a summer program soon. I've been looking at it.
Honestly, it kind of scared me when I went there.
Okay,
It was a lot
tell
to
me.
take in at once. I just didn't, when I spoke to their admissions, I didn't know it was as predominantly Buddhist as it was.
Okay.
They neglected to tell me that until I got there.
Yeah.
So it kind of scared me. So I was kind of, when you were saying like you bring in these things for your students as to look at, of course when they probably get into the class they probably know what they're like thinking, but going on the Catholicism and prayer, sometimes being thrown into something like into the deep end and just told to swim is very, very like terrifying, and like
Yeah.
sometimes I regret not going there because they don't have an art therapy major here for me, and they do there. But at the same time, I think sometimes students need to feel comfortable in their learning environment, and so I think maybe adding the word prayer to something is
Yeah.
what throws them into the deep end and makes them feel like they're
Yeah.
drowning. And so like that approach, maybe it's maybe like the wording in the whole like thing, like the whole system is like, if someone says, hey, I'm taking a class and I'm learning how to pray, immediately they're probably going to feel maybe a little bit attacked personally,
Yeah.
which could benefit them, but at the same time, like students need to feel comfortable in what they're paying for as well, you know? So it's kind of like, that's why I didn't go, I didn't feel comfortable there. I didn't feel like it would match me as much as I thought.
Yeah.
Like I needed to mature more to go there, I feel like.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting. Like I said, I'm always prepped for more pushback than I get from students in terms of like making them memorize texts and stuff in classes. But I do try to take it incrementally, and I do try to tell them the rationale, like why is this an important practice for what we're studying? Two more maybe?
Yeah. Is there, okay, we have 3 questions here. Could you all make it very brief, and we'll take all the questions, and then you can answer. Sure. Does that sound, yeah.
So I grew up Jewish, and conversation you're talking about where you're trying to separate the spiritual practice from the practice of improving the mental faculties of students is very much something that many Christians are very involved with, because people in Judaism are see it as more of a ethnic category, and the belief is not necessarily necessary membership. So I'm just curious if you interacted with
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. So I read an article in the past year that talked about how, just pragmatically speaking, the departments should expand beyond the non-Western tradition for the sake of distinguishing dissertations, fields of research, and so on. But I'm wondering how the pressures and demands to publish beyond become a professional academic might sort of push that field of research towards away from the methodologies you're talking about towards the traditional Western way of studying, specifically the analytic tradition. So if this article is right, there's a sort of like second order problem, like even if departments do beyond the traditional Western.
Let me answer these 2 real quick, just because I don't think I can hold it all in my head.
That's right. 3 is a little
yeah.
too much.
Well, it's interesting with the Jewish tradition. So I grew up Jewish, right? And I just recently started going to the synagogue in Des Moines. We got a new rabbi. She's a woman. She's really cool. But I took a class on, I never go to service, but I took a class on Maimonides. I just signed up for it like 2 weeks ago or so. And I learned about Maimonides, like his very hectic life. He had a difficult life, moving around, and worked as a doctor. He had no time for scholarship. He's like, you know, what we need to do, right, is like contemplative scholarship. Like that's all he wanted, right, out of his life, right? He was so busy he couldn't do it. And this is just more of a personal answer or anything, but it did make me think maybe there's something in my heritage that's prepped me to be so attracted to Zhu Xi and the model of like the life of the contemplative scholar that he promotes. Because there is definitely a similar tradition of textual study and contemplative scholarship in Judaism. Well, so thanks for that question. What was that? That's awesome. Well, one, how do you know that? That's awesome. In your question, that's a very good question, because this is something I've thought about. Like, what if someone said, you know, yeah, Leah, you're going to get to like rewrite our degree requirements for the program, and we're going to count not just sort of ancient and modern for the history courses, but someone could theoretically come through our philosophy department and have taken Han-dynasty philosophy and Song-dynasty philosophy for their history requirement. And then, is that student even readable on an application to graduate school? Right? Have they done anything that the committee at the grad school could look at and go, this is a student who has a degree in philosophy? Or have we made them so off the radar, right, within that kind of disciplinary structure that we can't move them forward? So I think, yeah, that the second order question, I think that way to put it, right, is this, yeah, is a big issue, right? Because, and Hawaii was hyper conscious about this, right? This is why the expectation was you should do it all, right? You need to do it all, because otherwise you'll never get a job. Like, you need to be able to present yourself as someone who can teach logic and like knows Kant, right? In addition to the other stuff.
the last question.
Yeah, my question is about just the philosophy of the worldview itself. It seems to me like a paradox almost that something undifferentiated like chi could contain inherently a structure or a higher order. I'm curious if Zhu Xi resolves that or if that's.
It's cool, right? Yeah. There's so much on that. All I can do at this point is encourage you to maybe read some of the great philosophers from the Song and Ming dynasties, right? So many of them debated precisely that relationship, right? What's the relationship between Qi and Li? What's the relationship between stuff and the order of that stuff, right? Does order exist in some sort of independent way of the stuff? Most people said it did, but then what is it, right? And why those tendencies, not others? So there's just a lot of great stuff there, right? A lot of great stuff, and that's precisely talking about kind of what kind of content does get brought into a philosophy classroom. And this goes back to the question of contemporary material, right? Tends to be the Buddha, like the historical Buddha, right? Lao Tzu, Confucius, right? Maybe Manza, right? But you get the very early material and then you never get all the rest of the stuff that comes after that, right? And that people during the Song and the Ming had precisely those questions and talked about them. And there's good stuff to read on that. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Well, please join me